Aiden moved carefully through the dense smoke and rubble, his visor cracked and suit scratched from the skirmishes of the day. The sky above was a dull, bruised red, a color that only seemed to grow darker with each breath he took. He'd lost count of the hours since the battle ended. Perhaps it was because he'd been focused solely on finding any remaining signs of life, or because of his vow to return any survivors home, human or otherwise. His head throbbed from the pressure of his helmet, but he pressed on, his instincts as sharp as ever. He was about to turn back when he saw something flickering beneath a twisted hunk of metal. There, caught in the shadows, was a figure, a woman, lying impossibly still, her skin shimmering with a faint, otherworldly glow. At first, Aiden thought she might already be gone, one more casualty in a battle that had left so many lost. But then he saw her chest rise and fall, shallow and weak, but unmistakably alive. He approached cautiously, unsure if she was conscious, or even if she'd welcome help from a human. Her features were strikingly alien, scales that shifted in color with the light, eyes large and expressive, but now clouded with pain. Her attire, torn and scorched, still hinted at its former elegance, marked with the symbols of a distant empire. A princess, he thought, or at the very least someone of importance. As he knelt beside her, she opened her eyes, a faint glimmer of violet that seemed to pierce through him. She flinched, recoiling slightly as if anticipating another blow, and he could feel the fear in her gaze, an instinctive distrust of someone who, to her, might as well have been a monster. "You're safe," he whispered, keeping his voice soft, knowing full well she wouldn't understand his words. "I'm not here to hurt you." With slow, deliberate movements, he reached for a medkit attached to his armor. She watched him warily, her hand twitching, as if trying to reach for a weapon that had long since been lost. He held up his hands, showing they were empty, and gestured to her wounds, hoping she'd understand he wanted to help. When she finally let him near, he saw the extent of her injuries. Her arm was badly bruised, scales missing in places, and a gash along her side was still bleeding, the wound deep enough to worry him. He took out a sterile cloth and cleaned the wound, each touch drawing a small wince, though she held her gaze steady. She must have been in unimaginable pain, yet she barely flinched. Resilient, he thought, admiring her strength despite the fear in her eyes. Darkness was falling fast, and the chill in the air was growing. He couldn't leave her here, not alone in the cold. Carefully, he picked her up, her body light in his arms despite her height. She made a soft sound, something between a gasp and a murmur, her fingers tightening on his armor for balance. They moved away from the wreckage, each step taking them farther from the haunting silence of the battlefield. Aiden found a grove nearby, its natural cover offering some protection from the cold. He set her down gently, making sure she was comfortable before gathering wood for a fire. The small flame flickered to life, casting long shadows over the grove. He glanced back at her, noticing her gaze on the fire, her eyes wide with fascination. For a moment, he wondered if she'd ever seen a fire before, if her people even needed it. But as the warmth spread, her tense posture relaxed ever so slightly, and she leaned forward, her body basking in the glow. Aiden sat across from her, studying her face. He noticed the subtle patterns in her scales, the way they shifted in color, as if responding to her emotions. She was watching him as well, her eyes tracing over his face and gear, perhaps wondering about him just as much as he was about her. Slowly, he reached out, offering her a small ration bar. She hesitated, clearly unfamiliar with the offering, but after a moment, she reached out and took it, her fingers brushing against his in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. She examined it, sniffed it, then took a tentative bite, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise at the taste. He chuckled softly, the sound breaking the quiet. In the light of the fire, she seemed almost otherworldly, like a spirit conjured from the stars. And yet, here she was, real and vulnerable, an alien princess stranded and alone. He could only imagine what horrors she'd faced, betrayal by her own, perhaps even loss of her entire world. But tonight, they were both survivors, bound by circumstance. She gestured at him, tapping her chest and then pointing to him. He understood immediately. She was asking his name. "Aiden," he said, pointing to himself. She listened, her head tilted in curiosity. "Aiden," he repeated slowly, hoping she'd catch it. Her lips parted, and after a moment, she echoed a "Den." He nodded, smiling at her attempt. Then, she tapped her own chest and spoke a word, her voice soft and lilting, musical in a way human speech was not. "Lariah," she said, each syllable rolling off her tongue like a song. "Lariah," he repeated, his voice softening around her name. It suited her, he thought, a name that sounded like starlight. They sat in silence for a while, both captivated by the quiet crackle of the fire. There was a gentleness between them, an understanding that transcended words. And though they couldn't speak of their pasts or share the burdens of their scars, they found solace in each other's presence. As the night deepened, Aiden felt the weight of exhaustion tugging at him, but he didn't want to sleep. There was something about this moment, this fragile connection, that he wanted to hold on to for as long as he could. He could tell she felt it too, her gaze lingering on the fire, as if afraid it might flicker out and leave them both in darkness once again. But eventually, her eyes closed, her breathing steadying as she slipped into a light sleep. Aiden watched over her, keeping the fire going and listening to the night. His mind drifted to his own battles, the friends he'd lost, and the emptiness he'd carried with him since. But tonight, that loneliness felt a little lighter, tempered by the quiet presence of the alien princess he'd saved. And though they came from different worlds, he felt a strange, unspoken kinship with her, a connection forged not by words, but by the shared experience of survival. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a fragile barrier against the chill of the alien night. Aiden kept his eyes on Lariah as she slept, watching the subtle rise and fall of her chest. Her breathing was still shallow, but steadier than before. The firelight played off her scales, casting an almost ethereal glow that made her look less like the wounded survivor she was and more like some ancient, timeless being who had simply stumbled into his world. The night was quiet but charged with an eerie sense of isolation. Aiden's senses were on high alert, trained by years of combat to pick up even the smallest sound. But here, in this strange grove under a foreign sky, there was nothing familiar. Only the soft hum of the wind through alien trees, the distant calls of creatures he couldn't name. It reminded him how far he was from home, how distant Earth was, a small speck in the endless cosmos. A soft sound broke his thoughts. He looked down to see Lariah stirring, her eyes fluttering open as if pulled back from a dream. For a brief moment, she looked disoriented, her gaze searching the dark before settling on him. Her expression softened slightly, a flicker of recognition and perhaps relief passing over her face. "Lariah," he said softly, trying her name again, and she turned her attention fully to him, studying him with a guarded, curious intensity. She attempted to sit up, grimacing as pain rippled through her. Aiden instinctively reached out, steadying her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. She tensed, glancing down at his hand, but didn't pull away. He withdrew it after a moment, unsure if his touch was welcome. To his surprise, she touched her own shoulder where his hand had been, her fingers lingering there as if testing a memory. Then she shifted her gaze to him again, her eyes filled with questions he couldn't begin to answer. He gestured to his chest. "Human," he said, pointing to himself. She watched him closely, her head tilting slightly as she seemed to turn the word over in her mind. "Who, man?" she murmured, her voice soft and lilting, wrapping around the syllables as though tasting each one. A faint smile touched his lips, and he nodded. Then he gestured to her, raising an eyebrow in silent question. She hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell him. Then, she pointed to herself. "Alarai," she said, then pointed to the sky, a wistful look crossing her face. Aiden repeated the word thoughtfully. "Alarai," he murmured, committing it to memory. So that was the name of her people, her world, or perhaps both. He nodded, showing he understood. Their conversation, if it could even be called that, continued through gestures and expressions. She gestured to the wound on her side, and he showed her the contents of his medkit, letting her inspect each item before applying a bandage to the worst of her injuries. She winced as he worked, but held steady, her gaze unwavering. As he wrapped her wound, he couldn't help but notice the way her eyes held his, filled with a mixture of gratitude and pain. There was strength there, a quiet resilience, but also a deep sadness, as though she carried the weight of something far greater than herself. He wondered what she had lost, what betrayal had left her alone on the battlefield, abandoned by her own. When he finished, she took his hand, pressing it gently as if to say thank you. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. He squeezed her hand in return, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. It had been a long time since he'd felt connected to anyone, human or otherwise. Yet here they were, two strangers bound by nothing but a shared moment, a bond forged in fire and survival. They fell into a comfortable silence after that, content to simply be in each other's presence. Aiden stoked the fire, adding a few more branches to keep it burning. Lariah watched the flames, her expression softening as the warmth chased away the chill of the night. After a while, she gestured to the stars, her gaze drifting upward. He followed her gaze, marveling at the strange constellations dotting the sky. Each one was unfamiliar, an alien tapestry woven from light, reminding him once again of just how far from home he was. She began to hum softly, a melody that was both haunting and beautiful, carrying a note of longing that resonated deep within him. Her voice was like a whisper on the wind, a song of her homeland, a place he would never see, a culture he would never fully understand. But in that moment, he felt as though he caught a glimpse of her world, a fleeting image painted in music and starlight. The melody grew softer, fading into the night as her eyes drifted back to the fire. She looked at him, her gaze filled with something unspoken, a silent question hanging between them. He didn't have the words to answer it, but he didn't need to. He reached across the fire, offering his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They sat like that for hours, two souls bound by an unspoken understanding, each finding comfort in the other's presence. He knew they were worlds apart, separated by culture, language, and the vastness of space itself. But in this moment, none of that mattered. When dawn finally broke, they watched the first light together, the colors of the alien sunrise casting a warm glow over the landscape. The warmth chased away the night's chill, but neither moved to break their silent connection. For now, they were not a human warrior and an alien princess. They were simply two people, survivors clinging to a fragile thread of hope in a universe that seemed determined to tear them apart. As the suns rose higher, Aiden knew their moment of peace was coming to an end. But he also knew he would do whatever it took to protect her, to see her safe. Because in that single night by the fire, she had become more than a stranger. She had become a part of his own story, a chapter he was unwilling to let end. As dawn stretched across the alien landscape, Aiden and Lariah knew that the warmth and security of the grove couldn't shelter them forever. Their silent connection, forged in the quiet hours of survival, was unbreakable, yet the world beyond their fragile sanctuary still waited, filled with uncertainty and danger. Aiden rose first, his movements careful as he tightened the straps on his gear. He reached out to Lariah, offering his hand to help her to her feet. She accepted, her grip still strong despite her injuries, her violet eyes meeting his with silent determination. The journey ahead was treacherous. Every few miles brought new challenges, unstable terrain, harsh winds, and the remnants of old battlefields. Yet they pressed on, each day strengthening their bond. When they reached the outskirts of a ruined outpost, Aiden spotted remnants of human tech, signal boosters, long dead, but still recognizable. It was a chance, however slim, to contact his own people. Aiden worked quickly, scrounging spare parts and wires, jerry-rigging a makeshift transmitter from what he could find. Lariah watched him work, her gaze a mix of curiosity and apprehension. When he finally sent the signal, he turned to her, explaining with simple gestures and hopeful eyes that he was calling for help. She nodded slowly, though he could sense her uncertainty. A tense silence followed as they waited, hidden among the twisted wreckage. Hours passed, and Aiden began to doubt the signal had even reached anyone. But then, just as the last light of the day faded, a low hum echoed across the sky, growing louder as a ship, a small Earth recon vessel, appeared on the horizon. Relief washed over Aiden, but as the ship landed, he felt Lariah's hand slip from his. He turned to see her standing back, her eyes wary. She looked to him as if seeking reassurance, and he moved to her side, gently taking her hand in his. "Trust me," he murmured, squeezing her hand, though he wasn't sure if she understood his words or the weight they carried. The Earth soldiers who stepped out of the vessel looked at him with shock, their eyes flicking to the wounded alien woman at his side. Aiden held his ground, sensing their tension. With a calm, firm voice, he explained the situation, advocating fiercely for Lariah, telling them of her bravery, her wounds, and the betrayal that left her alone. The soldiers hesitated but eventually nodded, extending a tentative offer of sanctuary. Aiden and Lariah boarded the vessel, each step bringing them closer to safety, though the weight of uncertainty hung heavy between them. During the flight, Aiden stayed by her side, the small space of the ship almost amplifying their quiet, unspoken bond. He held her hand through the turbulence, through the unsteady glances of the crew, and all the way until they reached the Earth Alliance's headquarters. In the days that followed, Lariah was treated by human medics, her strength gradually returning. Aiden visited her often, and as her wounds healed, they continued to share moments of quiet conversation, teaching each other fragments of their languages, their gestures and expressions filling the gaps between words. The more he learned, the more Aiden understood the depth of her pain, her isolation, and her fierce resilience. As word of Lariah's survival spread, factions on both sides grew interested in her, seeing her as a valuable figure, a potential political asset or even a weapon. But Lariah refused to become anyone's pawn again. One evening, when Aiden sat with her in the quiet of her quarters, she took his hand, her gaze steady and resolute. "Aiden," she said, her accent still lilting, "I go home." His chest tightened. The reality he'd been pushing away now lay before him. Lariah had a duty to her people, a destiny he could not keep her from. Yet the thought of her facing that world alone left a hollow ache in him. He nodded, managing a small smile. "I understand," he replied, though his voice was thick. But as he prepared to leave her room, she reached out, stopping him. She looked at him, her eyes bright and unwavering, and in halting English she said, "Aiden, with me." The simplicity of her words struck him like a thunderbolt, and a fierce sense of purpose bloomed within him. Without hesitation, he took her hand, and together they set off on the path toward the shuttle that would take them to her world. They returned to Alarai, a fractured place still reeling from the betrayal that had nearly cost Lariah her life. But with Aiden by her side, she stood resolute, reclaiming her place among her people. Through her resilience and his support, they gathered allies, rebuilding trust and alliances that had once seemed impossible. Together, they became a symbol of unity across the stars, a human warrior and an alien princess who had transcended the boundaries of language and war, proving that in the vastness of space, true loyalty and love could overcome even the deepest divides. And as they stood side by side, gazing out over the alien landscape of her home, their fingers intertwined, they knew that their journey was only beginning.